Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So my book comes out on May 25th, and I'm really excited to announce that I'm going to be having a virtual book launch at the New York Open Center on May 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be in conversation with Mirabai Starr, and we'll be talking about motherhood, obviously, and we'll be talking about Mirabai's work. And we're going to take a close look at a fairy tale and do some journaling around that. So I hope that you will consider joining us. The website is opencenter.org/motherhood, and we'll put that link in the show notes. I hope to see you there.
For today's episode, we're going to talk about values. This is something that I've been increasingly curious about in my work with analysts, and I've discovered an assessment tool which you can find at discoveryourvalues.com. This is based on a life's work of Shalom Schwartz, who is a social psychologist and a cross-cultural researcher and a rabbi. And he has developed a theory of values, a way of understanding them both as polarities and in certain categories, and advocates for the enormous value of knowing your values, that it allows us to claim a stance in the world, to recognize how we orient both internally and externally. And as we've been talking in preparation for the episode, it also gives us a real sense of ego versus shadow dynamics when broken down into values. Schwartz had identified 10 universal values across all cultures: self-direction, universalism, benevolence, conformity, security, power, achievement, hedonism, and stimulation. The 3 of us took this assessment, which we'll be talking about, and we'll be riffing on the importance of values and attitudes in our Jungian research and work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Joseph, you made this really good point as we were developing this, because we wondered to ourselves, okay, so what did Jung say about values? How do we think about this in a Jungian way? And I think, Joseph, you really landed it when you said, Jung talked a lot about attitudes. And I think he meant something very similar to what we're going to talk about today when we talk about values. What is the dominant value in the psyche? What is the dominant attitude? Those are very close together, those 2 things. What is it that motivates us?
That we have guiding foundational principles which we don't even recognize on a conscious level, but often in an analysis, as the self asserts, we can find a tectonic shift of core values, which has the power to rearrange our entire life, our priorities, what we like and don't like, what we will align with and align against.
It strikes me as an interesting moment to be even examining this question, because I think that it used to very much be the case that our values were handed to us by cultural authorities, by our religion, that there were some clear things that you were supposed to espouse and clear things that you were supposed to reject, but that's not so true anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think that we all have some received wisdom from the culture or our parents about what our values should be, but there's much more fluidity around that. And therefore, there's much more burden on the individual to do this work of discernment, to learn, what are my values? What does matter to me? What are the principles according to which I'm going to stand?
I also think that some values that are received are not particularly conscious. You know, we just sort of absorb them like we absorb vitamins from the food we eat. And it's only later in life and with some process of reflection and introspection that hasn't really been lifted up into consciousness, because it's just the way you do things. It's installed and instilled, and it's just sort of on automatic pilot.
It's just sort of working in the background.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about it in that way, we're beginning to say that values are complexes, because values are beliefs that are linked to affect. And when a value is activated, it is infused with feeling, just like a complex.
Yeah.
So if we have a strong value around honesty, for instance, and then we find ourselves, let's say, in a work situation where we are pressured to misrepresent something in a work situation or to withhold something, the value of honesty will activate and we'll move into a sense of distress. And part of that activation are all of the memories that are grouped around the value of honesty. So values, memories, and feeling are one dimension that I think is foundational.
I really like linking the values to complexes of these centers of just sort of automatic activation, that it can be surprisingly difficult to grab hold of, as the feeling, as it always does with a complex, comes up. And to use your example of somebody with a strong value around honesty who is being pressured, maybe in a work environment, to just ignore something or let it go, or not pick up on a customer complaint, let's say, of that feeling is what clues us to a misalignment with our own internal set of values. And that is often the way we know it for the first time, is something comes up in us where this doesn't feel right.
And as you were saying, that can be inherited. You know, if we're raised in a home, school, a religious environment where the individuals are policed for certain behaviors, they'll be praised for something like honesty, or perhaps confronted and shamed for not being honest. And those memories shape the value around that quality.
Joseph, I just want to lean into that for 1 second, because I would argue that even if we're not raised in a religious home, I mean, I think sometimes we can tend to sort of polarize a little bit and say, well, religion, is sort of straitjackets us psychologically. And I just want to move off of that for a second. I would say that we're always raised in environments where there are values. Those values may not be formal, they may not be conscious, but we're always going to be policed and shamed for certain things And it may not be made explicit. I mean, I think if you're raised in a traditional religion, sometimes the values are extremely explicit, like the 10 commandments. And here's what we value, and here's what you should never do. But even if we didn't grow up in a religious home, our family had values, and those were transmitted to us in some fashion.
Yeah.
Of course.
In fact, it might be, in some sense, easier to deal with a legacy of family values or family values passed on to us by our family when they've been made explicit.
And what I'm going back to connecting it with the complexes and feeling is that the values are so connected with family, educational systems, religious dictates. They are the basis of relationship. This is how we relate to one another in our family. You will not, as a child, contravene a strongly held value without risking the bond with your parents and other family members. Same thing holds for school, same thing holds for church or other organized religion. You're risking the relational bond itself if you protest or disagree with even unstated values. And values don't have to be stated in order to be very powerful. Such as a value around not puffing yourself up, not being front and center, not being loud, not being noticed, but being modest and considerate and putting others first. That's a value that's often not stated, but can be extremely powerful.
And as we are absorbing all of these values from all the groups and institutions that influence us, it is immediately shadow making, because the self is a whole, having all qualities. So as we're pressed to be honest, the capacity to be dishonest or self-serving goes into the shadow and rumbles around. Often we relieve pressure through dreams of being tricky, for instance. And I have a very vivid memory of myself with this particular value, or this polarity between conforming to honesty, and its polarity in the value system is stimulation. And I remember that me and a group of boys, I think we might have been 9 years old, and transgressively we would walk about a mile away from the neighborhood. This is back in the 70s, so you could kind of get away with that. And we would walk down to a Woolworths store. And in the Woolworths, there were these enormous shelves of candy. And one summer, we became absolutely compelled with the idea that each of us had to steal a piece of candy, which was extremely transgressive and terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it looked bizarre, these 9-year-old kids just like haunting, a Woolworths, strangely. But in that tension, that one part of me wanted or had this value of conformity with this honest and self-regulated values, and another part of me wanted to be wildly stimulated. And I remembered walking in and my heart pounding and my senses being widened and scanning for danger. And it was very exciting and, of course, inappropriate. And lo and behold, I did escape with some kind of a chocolate bar. And it clearly made an enormous impression on me, because at
even to this day,
49, I'm still talking about it. But that tension between those two values created a storm of intensity inside of me. And, I was able to learn something about myself, one of which is I did not enjoy being that stimulated. It was incredibly anxiety provoking, but it was very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think where you're going, Joseph, is, Schwartz outlined these 10 values, and that each of us has the capacity to be each one of these things and to value each one of these things. And we may be consciously aligned with certain of these values, but that doesn't mean that we don't have the opposite value somewhere in the unconscious as well. When you talked about the shadow making quality, if our family really values achievement, for example, and that's what we're kind of taught to focus on, the other side of that is, according to this work, is benevolence. So if we come from a family that is really asking us to focus on achievement and success and ambition, we may find ourselves wanting to spend our lives working for a nonprofit.
And that moves us into another dimension of values that has to do with goals, that our values motivate action. And of course, this is something that the culture is very much involved in. For instance, social justice or justice in general as a value is rumbling in the collective and is motivating tremendous shifts in the culture, in legislation, subcultures like particular corporations, and it's energizing behaviors. On a personal level, if a value is very high, that's going to rouse us as well. I think of some of my clients who are entrepreneurs, and for them, achievement, this self-enhancing achievement, is very, very energized. And I hear in them the tension between that and benevolence, and they really have to put this concern for the general welfare of humanity has to really sit in the shadow in order for them to be as unobstructed about their entrepreneurial goals as many of them are. And it's very charismatic to not be conflicted around a value that drives a goal.
That raises such an interesting point about what is it like to be conflicted about a goal, to have a conscious value around achievement or honesty or social justice. And maybe the proof of the pudding is, does it really drive behavior or does it not? That oftentimes our stated values are what happens? It's not really motivating me. I might find myself not in daily or actionable alignment with that particular goal.
And that internal tension, Jung might call a neurosis, that there's a blocking or a fighting between different values held by different internal images. And it can create a real enormous amount of tension. I can relate a dream series that I had a number of years ago, and I apologize to some listeners who have heard me say this before, but it fits so well. At this time in my life, I was in my late 20s. I'd become an Alexander technique teacher, which is a kind of movement work, and I was trained in several other different healing modalities. And part of the drive around being, quote unquote, a healer was both universalism and benevolence. There was a sense that I was doing something good, that I was a kind of gift, and that people's payment back to me was almost a donation, that the service I provided came through me as a conduit of some kind, and that their payment was just for my time in order to be there and witness. I mean, it was very lofty and kind of making me crazy in the situation, but it was also making me, putting me in a lot of financial trouble, having all these lofty universal goals. And so I began to have dreams, and in the dreams, a guy would break into my townhouse. I would hear him coming up the stairs. I would reach for a gun in my side table, and I would shoot him when he got to the top of the stairs. And I had this dream for weeks and weeks and weeks, feeling very endangered. And then finally, I did an active imagination about the dream. I was very new to Jungian work. And the fellow at the top of the stairs said, well, I'm so glad you're talking to me. And then he and I went out into the street imaginally at about 3 a.m. And he gave me a long, inspiring talk about achievement, about going for it in life and getting what you need and taking your part of the pie so that you can have a life and, create these other things that you want for yourself. It was profoundly affecting to me and allowed that polarity of achievement and benevolence to balance out, which of course allowed me to continue to work without kind of going under.
So there's such a great story. And what it brings up for me is that it's important that we have values, that we have values whether we know it or not. That it's important work to know what our values are, but it's also important not to be overly identified with a particular value, because then we become one-sided, which is what happened to you. I mean, it's wonderful to identify with benevolence and universalism and to want to help people. But if that becomes too rigid, or if it becomes a part of our persona and we're not able to access the compensating value, then we are at risk.
And we can go along for a great deal of time in the camp of one single value. And sooner or later, if we're paying attention to our dreams, the opposite wants attention as well, wants to create a certain creative dynamism inside of us.
And I think we can also pay attention to our behavior. Am I really living this value? What did I actually do today? Isn't that funny? I spent the day kind of goofing off and fiddling around and not doing the thing that I sort of would like to believe I'm dedicated to and value. Our values really should motivate action. And when there's a disjunction, it's not that hard to notice.
Well, I think that's a great point. If another way to say it is look at your actions, and that will reveal to you your values. And when I took this assessment, there was a little instruction video at the beginning that said, if it's really important, it will be something that you've acted on in the past couple of days. And that sort of sets you straight because, something comes up about, say, valuing the environment. And well, yeah, that's something I feel really passionate about. But have I acted on it in the past couple of days? That was kind of eye-opening. There is this way that values are an invisible matrix.
And they particularly serve as standards or criteria. That's when we're talking about actions, that when we're evaluating our actions, events, people, policies, and deciding whether it's good or bad or justified or not justified or worth doing or something I'm just going to dispose of, all of that stuff is informed by our underlying values, and sometimes even just a singular value that has taken a very kingly position in the psyche.
So what I'm connecting this with, and it's so interesting how many Jungian bedrock concepts this links up to, is libido or energy. Of where is my energy really going?
Yeah, where is the gradient?
Yes, what is it that I really want to do and simply have interest in and energy for, versus what I wish I were doing or should be doing.
Think I should be doing.
Yes,
right.
Exactly. The shoulds come up right away. But I think, really the behavior never lies. What we're doing is kind of where our energy or libido is flowing, and it can be very informative.
And while Jung talked about images which guide these driving forces, I like that Schwartz is talking about them as ideas, because that actually is part of the Jungian canon, but it's rarely brought up. Jung sprinkles throughout the collected works and his other writings the concept that an archetype can be an image, it can be a feeling, and it can be an idea, which has to do with the typology of the individual and how they are able to relate to it. This concept of archetypes being ideas was informed by Jung's work with Gnosticism, which he found incredibly illuminating and congruent with these ideas he was gestating in the back of his mind. And in Gnosticism, which is an ancient religious system, God, as this universal unknowable being, creates the Son, S-O-N, and then the Son creates various ideas. And these ideas exist as defining cosmic principles in what they call the pleroma. And these pairs of opposite concepts are required to be in relationship in order for the universe to function. And for Jung, he thought that this really was relevant to the internal universe or the internal cosmos to function. So the myth of Sophia and the fall of Sophia is all part of this when the pairs of opposites rupture. So I think that Jung's idea about the pleroma is very much informed and part of the way Schwartz is talking about this.
You know, I'm thinking about the way that so many fairy tales will start off with a king. And we're often taught to think about the king as the dominant attitude in the culture. And that might be the ruling value or the ruling idea, as you were talking about, Joseph. And then often, the king becomes ill or he can't have children. That's a common theme in fairy tales. And the hero is the one that needs to solve this problem. And frequently, as we've spoken about before on the podcast, the hero is the youngest son who doesn't know what he's doing, or he's the soldier who is deserting from the war. So he is some kind of countercultural figure in a way who appears from the standpoint of the dominant value to be worthless, but in fact brings the value that would renew the culture or renew the psyche. So I think, again, Joseph, back to what you were saying, it's these compensating pairs. There's a way that the pendulum just swings back and forth between them, I think, both collectively and in our psyche. I mean, one of the things that happened when the three of us took it, as at least me and Deb, we were saying, wow, this is sort of a shift from how I used to be, or I think it might be almost a reaction to where I've been putting my energy recently. So that, we just experienced our psyche's compensation. It says, no, we're not going to worry about that anymore. This is now the thing that matters.
And that movement and experience between the polarities is what builds consciousness. Jung talked extensively about the tension of the opposites, but also the movement between opposites matures the personality. This is another way in which Freud's work also brought forward this tension between tradition and hedonism. And hedonism is a word that has a bad rap, but it simply means things that please the senses. So whether it's, the most delicious apple pie your grandma ever made, or something more racy that gives you great pleasure, that Freud noticed that the Viennese culture in his day was so entrenched with conformity and tradition that the normal instincts around sexuality were so ferociously cut off that people were becoming strangely symptomatic. And part of the early work of psychoanalysis was to create a more living, conscious tension between hedonism and tradition, which was curative for many people, and we might even say for the culture at large.
So I feel like this is probably the time for me to jump in with a bit of self-disclosure that when I put myself through this interesting assessment process, one of my top values at the very top was hedonism. which at first, I'm thinking about what you said about Freud and Vienna and conformity and tradition, but hedonism, although it sounds superficial, is also a very personal value. In other words, it's determined by the individual, not by the culture. Nevertheless, there are some surprises here in this assessment.
I am totally curious about a few examples of your emerging hedonism.
Yes, Deb, tell us.
Tell us.
I would like to say that, I was rather surprised that this came up on top. And yet, as I sat with it, I realized how compensatory it is to what's on the other side of this circle, basically around conformity and tradition and working. And so I am now really noticing my wild embrace of hedonistic things like watching a Netflix series, having having a quitting time at night, and I am reading a novel. I have also gone out to buy prepared food that I just stick in the microwave. And it's not just since taking this assessment, but what has happened is that it has inspired me to notice where a lot of my energy, my libido is going. That I want to chill, and that I have been kind of sneaking these things in. Mm-hmm. And now it's front and center. It's like, whoa, yesterday I went to the store and I bought even more prepared food. It was conscious, and it was in every possible way delicious.
Yeah, I mean, you see how the unconscious brings forward the missing value and presents it to consciousness first in these kind of sneaky ways, like, oh, maybe I'll buy some prepared food. and then hopefully there can be a process where consciousness integrates that value and says, yes, I want to knock off early. I want to be able to just have a relaxed afternoon. I don't want to have to spend hours slaving in the kitchen. I'm going to claim this. Yes. And then we might imagine that if we become too aligned with those values, then later the unconscious may say, no, it's time for something else. So it could be this continual evolution that we have.
It really does lift up from shadow into awareness. Values that one, at least I am then able to claim. And where I go with that is, what's it like out there in the collective? And maybe in the collective, it masquerades as virtue signaling. You know how really honorable we are, how much we embrace social justice, how much we value children and raising children, educating children, providing children with secure homes and so on. And the shadow is, no, we don't. There are, I think we all know that our foster care system is a mess, that there are more children now in poverty than there were 50 years ago or so. Childhood poverty is rampant. This whole thing, from my own process to looking out there at the collective, really points up how hard it is to embrace the shadow. And as you say, Lisa, just claim it, that this is what is, and not slather it over with, my wonderful work ethic or our collective values around the importance of children.
I think this is really important, particularly when we're talking about governments, organizations, institutions who will espouse values around benevolence, for instance. But really, watching their policies and behaviors, it's clear that benevolence is actually not what's happening, that is not the actionable value that's driving things. But by wrapping it in the language of benevolence and universalism, it can confuse people and confuse them strongly enough to make them jump on a bandwagon.
I mean, we've talked about values being handed down from family or from religious institutions in a kind of unthinking way. We were talking about that earlier, and now, Joseph, you're lifting up the way that institutions can claim certain values, and that can be confusing to us. I think there's real value in looking at your values, understanding what actually it is that motivates you, because there's something that's motivating you, and it would be good for you to understand what that is. And part of what comes up for me is this very important question: what are you in service to? We may all have a story that we tell ourselves about what we're in service to, but really, are you in service to that, or are you in service to something else? And it can be helpful to know this, because without knowing it, first of all, you're being ridden by an unconscious agenda that may not even be your own. But you're also likely to sort of flap about in the wind and be blown ever which way, rather than saying, you know what, this is important to me. This matters to me. There's value in knowing your values.
And embedded in that is the connection with libido and shadow and complexes. So it's interesting to me that there is this opportunity to do this assessment that automatically almost makes such a connection with parts of our own personality that may be in the unconscious, and lifting them up in ways that are pretty specific and informative. It's a good tool to do some, to link one up with parts of oneself that have real depth and possible revelatory propensity to them.
What that evokes for me, Deb, is how powerful it is for people to find language to describe their core values, and how, while unconscious values can press upon the ego, it's often an inefficient way of manifesting its presence. Mm-hmm. That when we can go deep enough, when we can analyze ourselves fully enough, we can consciously lay claim to what's the internal priority, and then the ego can choose to be in service to what is true inside of us. And that relieves an enormous tension and a self-defeating predisposition. And that goes to another one of Schwartz's observations, is that values are ordered by importance and relative importance. That we have a number of different important values that are energized in the psychic landscape, and any one thing that we're involved with often involves a spectrum of values, or constellates them and activates them. And we often do have a cost-benefit feeling about any number of choices. And there is a sense of cost for most of us. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. For instance, it's not uncommon for me to talk to fellow psychotherapists, and this is a constant conversation we have between taking insurance or actually deciding you're going to go into business for yourself and not take insurance, to be employed by some kind of a large institution versus being self-employed. And this is the tension between security versus self-direction. And I've had psychotherapy friends who've agonized in the tension between those two things, and particularly feeling caught in the value of security and longing to move into self-direction and just feeling roasted by that. Now, I would suggest that they have both of those values, but in relative importance, security is still relatively higher than self-direction, but they do feel the pot boiling underneath it.
I want to just see if I can apply some of this to Jung a little bit, to his actual biography, because I'm thinking about the Swiss collective value of conformity and tradition, and the fact that Jung felt really called to have this relationship with Tony Wolff, which he carried on the relationship relatively openly for some number of years. And I can imagine that he was roasted to some degree between the values of conformity and tradition and the opposing ones of stimulation and hedonism in deciding to carry out this relationship with Wolff. And, Jung talks about, he doesn't talk about that very much, but there are other places where he talks about these shifts in values that happen for him, where something took on supreme importance and it just gained so much weight in the unconscious that he just had to follow it no matter what. And I'm thinking about his interest in alchemy. He got so seized by that, and it was really his value to pursue ideas like that. Tony wasn't really interested in alchemy. That's kind of when their relationship cooled, because pursuing that idea of alchemy was that there was a higher value on that than in continuing this relationship.
I'm imagining on this wheel that Shalom Schwartz has helpfully provided that the two opposites here are self-direction and Jung's incredibly strong value that he lived out around self-direction and following his interests, and that the compensatory or shadow function is security. And he had that because of the financial security that came with his having married Emma. They had a beautiful house in Zurich. And so his material needs were well met, thus allowing him to pursue tremendous self-direction in all kinds of ways, of which we are the beneficiaries.
Mm-hmm. I just want to bring in another personal story, just as we're tracking how this actually looks in the life of a person. And it's a dream story. So when I was in graduate school the first time, I lived alone in a studio apartment in Manhattan, and I had this really beloved cat. And I used to, if I was going to be gone for the weekend or something, I would pay this older woman who was a neighbor. She was a really lovely, sweet older woman, to watch my cat. And this woman loved my cat because my cat was great. She was a great cat. And so this older woman really, really loved my cat. And I had this dream that I had been away, and this older woman whose name was Eleanor had watched my cat, and I was going to pay Eleanor for looking after her. And Eleanor said something like, "Well, you owe me $600. And the dream ego was incensed. I was outraged. I was like, "What do you mean? That's ridiculous." So when I was pondering what this dream meant, I think that my inner Eleanor was really trying to lift up a value that I was undervaluing, which I think was something in the line of self-direction, so that there was a kind of feminine instinctual part of me that needed some tending to, that needed some care. And I was not valuing it enough because I was more over in that security side. And I'm just basing that on kind of what was going on for me in my outer life at that time. But I think there's another example for how the dream kind of brings the compensatory value.
Mm-hmm. That puts me in mind of someone that I worked with years and years ago who dreamt that she was somewhere out in the country and had left a cottage or cabin that she was staying in, and was walking and running across a field, and noticed that the field had many, many little small snakes that were, 8 to 12 inches high. And she was horrified, even though she also knew they were harmless. And she climbed a tree, and there was a platform, so there was a sort of rudimentary kind of tree house there. And as she sat looking down at this field with all these little snakes, the dream shifted, and the snakes became one larger snake, about 4 feet high, that looked up at her. And she looked down at it and engaged with this shadow element that was, snakes are grounded. They don't have legs, so they're on the ground. And an instinctual element that, in her very intellectualized and routinized life, represented a kind of energy that she needed to connect with. And that relates to values.
Mm-hmm.
Our conscious and over civilized life with all of our conveniences. And she was living in New York City and so far away from this important value that got imaged so vividly in this dream of reconnecting with her own nature and the natural world as well.
And Deb, that's such a beautiful dream. And one of the things, maybe it's a question that comes up for me, is where do our most deeply held values come from? And I suppose, we've been talking today about how values can shift and values compensate one another and values can change depending on what's going on in your life. But are there really core values that we perhaps come into the world with, that we need to try to find a way to live in alignment with those values? Because I just told this little story about this dream that I had when I was 27 or 28, and that perhaps the thing it was bringing in was self-direction. Well, guess what my highest value was on this assessment? It was self-direction. So is this something that I have needed to live out in this deep way? And therefore, do those values, do they emanate from the self? And do they come into the world with us almost as if they were a part of our fate?
It seems reasonable, as we said, that Jung believed that archetypes can show up as images, ideas, feelings, but that they have a certain congruence, consistency inside of us. So it makes sense to me that each of our individual selves is pressing upon us in these values as well as these images, and that part of individuation is yielding to things that the environment may never have introduced us to, but something deeper is still demanding of us.
I really like the idea here of really transpersonal values, which is what I think you're pointing to,
Yes,
Lisa.
yes, that's exactly right.
What we may come into the world with as our destiny or our fate, what we're in service to. And it ties into the question that Jung said was the most important one, which is whether a man is related to the infinite or not, a man or obviously a woman. Are we related to something that is beyond, just oneself?
Mm-hmm. This is at the top of my mind because I believe it was recently her 100th birthday. But Sophie Scholl, who was executed by the Nazis for her, she was involved in organizing to oppose them. Some of her last days were, "It is such a splendid sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter if by our acts thousands are warned and alerted? So talk about being in touch with some transpersonal value that sustains you even in the face of death.
And I think this was Viktor Frankl's cry.
Yeah.
That in the face of the massive amount of suffering that human beings may be exposed to, that it is meaning, values, these organizing archetypal ideas that allow us to tolerate the struggles and suffering of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think Jung felt very moved in a similar way. He had these values that called out to him to be lived, and he didn't know what else to do but to live them out, even though at times they did put him at odds with the culture.
He said in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections that in his elder years, he was incapable of acting on an idea unless libido flowed towards it, unless the deeper part of the psyche provided the energy and activation for him to manifest something. So there is a level at which we can become so attuned to the self that we can track what that deepest part of ourselves is turning on and turning off. And the ego could learn both to sacrifice and benefit from aligning with those shifts of force.
Yeah, so I think at a deep level, knowing our core values, our deep values, requires a connection to the transpersonal. And it is these and knowing these and being in alignment with these that allows us to make profound commitments.
Maybe it's time for us to switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Our dreamer today is a man, 31 years old, who is a film editor. And here's the dream. I am on my school oval playing volleyball with my peers, though I am not a teenager anymore. I'm not very good at playing. I often miss the ball because the sun is in my eyes, or I unknowingly break a rule. Each time I fail, I expect everyone to criticize me, like they would have in the real world, but instead they are quite friendly and understanding. Eventually, I get the hang of it and have fun. Suddenly, I notice a huge cherry tree blossom in a tree that's caught fire just beyond the volleyball court. Despite the bark turning black like charcoal, the flowers remain vivid and beautiful and untarnished. I am struck with this beautiful sight against the cloudy white sky, and I reach for my phone to take a photo, but I cannot find it, so I simply sit and watch it with awe. And for context, he says, when I was in high school, I was heavily criticized and bullied and made to feel very inadequate. The people I was with in the dream would all have been highly critical in the real world had I missed the ball during a game of school sport. It has taken me a long time to seek therapy and begin to unpack the ways in which it affected me, most notably how I have developed an incredibly harsh and cruel inner self-critic. The main feelings in the dream, he says, was there was a strong sense of perseverance that I was not going to give up. There was also relief when my peers didn't criticize me for missing the ball. This is the kind of dream that I think of as a gift from Psyche, a gift from the self.
Say more, Deb.
It seems like a dream of such profound confirmation and encouragement of that, unlike his history of being criticized and made to feel inadequate, here while he's playing volleyball, people are friendly and understanding, and eventually he attains mastery. He says, eventually I get the hang of it and have fun. And then there is this wonderful image that reminds me of Jung's Liverpool dream of the cherry tree that, despite having caught fire, is gloriously abloom with blossoms that the dream ego can take in. He appreciates it. He is awestruck by it.
So one of the questions that I have is, I wonder what's been going on in the current life of the dreamer. Mm-hmm. The dream would indicate to me that he is gaining some, improved relationship with this inner critic. So we might say that his complex around inadequacy is shifting a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the ego is a little bit more robust against these inner critics, because they're not critical. They're understanding. Right. And that allows him to gain mastery. And it is true, we don't gain mastery if we're being criticized or shamed. I mean, that is not an ideal learning environment. You have to have some freedom to get good at something. It's when he says, I gain mastery and have fun, or he says, I get the hang of it and have fun, then I see the tree. So it's the spirit of play, that kind of liminal in-between space of play and fun, that allows him to have this vision of this transcendent tree. And Deb, you mentioned the Liverpool dream, but I'm also thinking of the burning bush. I mean, this is a profoundly archetypal image, this tree that is burning and yet does not burn. And it does remind me of several fairy tale images of similar trees. So this is an image of something of transpersonal nature.
Yes.
That he is granted a vision of. I mean, it's almost like the vision of the Grail. He is granted a vision of it when he is able to enter this liminal space of play and fun that he can only attain when the voices of the inner critics are quieted.
I resonate with all of the things you guys have said. I'm also holding this from a typological standpoint, just to put that lens on it. So the fellow was saying that historically, he has not had easy access to his physicality. He normally would have found it very difficult to participate in sports and been perhaps badly treated or even harassed by schoolmates. So in the dream, he's reclaiming his inferior sensation function. All of our inferior functions, which means the parts of our personality that for whatever reason we haven't developed quite fully, rest in great part in the unconscious, and they also act as portals, so to speak, between the ego and the much deeper parts of the unconscious. So there's something about him accessing his physicality and sensate function that then creates this burning bush image. And the tree that is on fire, whose blossoms are not consumed, I think is a symbol of the archetypal forces that come through his physical sensation. And it is really quite a religious image. And I might venture for this person that the place of greatest agony is often where the God manifests. So there is a beckoning in the dream, which the two of you have also referenced, that it's in the body for you particularly, that it's likely you will encounter the deepest aspects of the unconscious, and whether that's through physicality or sensuality or sexuality, any number of ways that one can approach the body is where the divine mystery may very well lay for you.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I like that a lot. I'm also thinking about volleyball and the nature of volleyball and how it requires one to sort of keep the ball in the air and not drop the ball, as it were. Or he says he misses the ball. So that there's something about that image, and either that it's a sort of an internal dynamic of having to work as a team with these inner energies, or even commenting on the ability to do that in the outer world, to work with others interpersonally.
That's exactly where my mind was going, was the social aspect of all of this. That he said when he was in high school, he was criticized and bullied and made to feel inadequate. And in volleyball, it is definitely a team sport. People on the same team have to be able to pop the ball up to team members, get it to somebody who's at the front of the line who can then spike it. So there's something here about the dance, in a way, with other people on the team that I think points to a real transformation or shift in his social ease and feeling connected with people. And they're friendly and supportive.
Well, and the dream on an inner level is saying, look, you have some inner supports here.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.